Hello everybody. So in this screencast we would like to look at how can a fragment communicate back to the activity. So for the fragment to communicate back to the activity, there is some kind of information or some kind of process that we have to follow, because the fragment needs to get an instance of the activity, right, in order to communicate back with the activity. And usually we don't get the whole instance of all the activity. We actually use an interface. So the activity should implement an interface, and then using that interface, the fragment is going to communicate back with the activity. Okay, so let's say, for example, in our running example that we have been using, where you click on these buttons, the color and the title changes. Let's say you want the fragment to control if these buttons work, are enabled or are not enabled, right? So if the fragment actually let's have for example a switch here, where you could select if it's on, this means these buttons are on. If it's off, these buttons, even if you click on them, nothing should happen, right? And this means that when you change the button, the fragment needs to communicate back to the activity that this change has happened, right? Okay. So let's see how we are going to do this. Let's look at the layout first. Let's add our switch. Here is the switch. And basically this is a frame layout. Let's change it to a relative layout. We go right click here, and we could say convert to a relative layout. Here we are. Okay. And then this is your text, and let's make it its height is wrap content. And we get this guy, we put it under here, and then this guy is at the top. Let's go back to the code so that we could fix this. There is a -19. Let's remove this -19. Go back to the design. You could see that the switch is under it. You can also add some we could add a margin top, for example, for the switch. Margin top, let's say 16 dp. Here we are, and there is a switch, and then we can change its enable, disable, right? We can do that, right? So that's the button. Now when you run it, let's run this. Does it still look the same? Yes. Here is the fragment. We can make also the color here, text color to white. So I need Android color white. So basically just to make it white so that at least we could see it. Then we run it again. You will see that there is enable, disable. This is the fragment. There is enable, disable, and then you can click this button to change, is it on or off? You want to make it on. I think you could say checked to true. In that case it's on. Okay, we run it. So now it will start off as being on. Here it is, right? Anyhow, so we have the switch. The switch is here. Let's get its ID. This is the switch, right? So that's, we'll call it switch, right? So that's the ID of it is switch. It seems that this ID is used somewhere. It's not happy for some reason. And let's, okay, ID switch 1. Okay, let's go back to the design. Here it is. I can change its name here. Switch enable. There it is. Okay, so that's my switch, and here we are. Okay, very nice. So now how do I get access to the switch? I can get access to the switch here. I could say switch. Is it called switch or switch view? Let's have a look. What is it called? So we go back to the code. It's called switch, right? So we go back again. The type is switch. So here's the switch. Here's the name of it, and I can get it here. I could say switch equals find view by ID, which is view dot find view by ID, view by ID r dot ID dot switch enable. So I have access to the switch, right? So now I can set up an event listener to this. Switch dot set on what? On check change listener. Here it is. See, new on okay, on check change listener, right? Here it is. And basically let's see if this works. Log D, and I'm just going to just see if this works. So basically I just set up the handler for this switch. When you change the switch, it should print to the log. So let's look at the log. Here it is. It is changing, you see here. Now you see the on check change listener. It also gives you the state of the is checked or not is checked, the boolean, right? For example, if you say if is checked, that's the new state of the switch. Else this means it's not checked, right? So basically what you could do is you could come here, say okay on, and then this one is off, right? Okay. Alright, so when we run it, you will see when we, okay, if we switch it, now it's going to be off. So we go here, now it's off, see? We switch it again, it's on, off, on. Okay, cool. So we have set up the handler correctly, right? So we want to pass this boolean to the activity. Okay, so to do that, we need to capture the activity. So to capture the activity, we'll capture it on attach. On attach is when the fragment is attached to the activity. And basically the context is basically the context implementation of the activity. Anyhow, so basically what we need to do is we need to first create an interface, public interface, and we'll call it, for example, custom, or maybe we call it, for example, listener interface, right? And then the method that we're going to include in the interface is void. It has no doesn't return any parameters, and I could say set status, or for example set button enabled, right? And then it will pass a boolean, and that will be the status, right? That's basically the listener, right? So basically what we want to do is we want the main activity to implement that listener, okay? And what happens is that the activity is going to be passed on as the context, and then we grab the activity and we cast it to the listener. So how do we do that? We'll go declare a variable, and we'll call it, let's say we declare the variable here, we'll call it my iListener. Is of instance of an implementation of, and we call it mListener. Okay, so now where do we initialize this? We initialize it on the onAttach, right? So basically when we come in here, we'd say if the context is instance of, and we call it the iListener, right? If it's of this, if it's of an instance, if it implements that interface, then we'll say mListener equal to context. So in that case, we have grabbed the and we cast it to the iListener, right? So we catch it. Else, and traditionally in Android what we used to do is we throw an exception, throw new runtime exception, and we'll say context dot to string, just to get the name of it, and basically we are going to add a string, and we'll say needs to implement this listener. Okay, so must implement the listener, which is this one, right? Okay. So basically now what we're going to do is, what's going to happen is that when the onAttach happens, it's going to check to see does it implement the iListener. If that's the case, we'll get an instance of it and store it in this variable, right? In this mListener variable. So I have the mListener variable. So basically all what I need to do is that when you come in here, I could say mListener dot set button enabled, and I can pass it the is checked. And in that case, I'm passing the value to whoever implements the interface. Of course, the main activity needs to implement the interface. Let's run it without the main activity implementing the interface, and we'll see what happens. So basically, we'll run it. Let's remove this, and it did crash. So basically, why did it crash? If you scroll up a little bit, it threw the exception that we just created. So if you look here, it says fatal exception, and the exception is on the onAttach. If you scroll down a little bit, you should see the error message. So here, when you look at it, we threw that exception, and basically we are trying to get the name of the method, and it should show it here. It should show that, see, here it is, com.activity must implement the mListener, right? That's the message that we just created. Why? Because the activity does not implement the listener. So let's go and do it. So we'll do here, implements, and iListener, so that implements the iListener. Now it's not happy because you have to implement the methods, and you click on implement the methods, and we want to set the buttons enabled, and it comes to be here, right? So what we could do here is maybe we can have a boolean, and that boolean starts off as, let's say we have a boolean and we set it to enabled or buttons enabled equal true. Let's start with them all being enabled, and then when you toggle this, you just toggle it. So basically button enabled will be equal to status. That's basically all what it's going to do, right? It's going to change the button enabled to this. And then basically in these methods that we have here, which is the on click, we could say if button enabled, right? We can do that. In that case, we could make sure that nothing happens if the buttons are not enabled, right? So basically we do the same thing here. If button enabled, then do something, otherwise don't do anything. We'll go here. Okay. And similarly, we do the same thing here. If button enabled, and we go from here. Here we go. All right. So basically, let's recap a little bit what we have done. We in here on attach, we grab the context and we cast it to a listener, to an iListener, which is the interface. So that's why if you see mListener, doesn't have that many methods. It just has the method that we created. You know, even though the context has many methods. So if you do context dot, you see how many methods the context has. But we shrunk the scope of the that instance to only be the methods that we're interested in, right? And also we can check to see if the activity or whoever comes in, the context that comes in here has to implement that interface, right? And then we use that interface where we use it here. So when the user checks the button or removes the switch, we can pass on the data from the switch, from the fragment to the activity. So let's run it and see. Okay. So we're running it right now. Let's look at the logcat, see if it's going to crash again. All right, perfect. So it didn't crash. And you can see that it's enabled, right? And I could change the colors, right? Now if I disable it, right? Now it's disabled, right? Now when I check the colors, nothing changes. Why? Because the state of we passed on the boolean from here to the activity, and that boolean because it's false now, this if statement block is not executed, right? This block is not executed because now it's false, right? So now when you click, nothing happens. So we did pass data from the fragment to the activity. Now if I check it again and then click, you see it works. Check it back, clicks, it's not working. Why? Because it's not enabled, right? Now the buttons enabled is false. So basically we have demonstrated how we can pass data from the activity, from the fragment to the activity. And also we demonstrated in the previous screencast how to pass data from the activity to the fragment. So basically let's slowly go through this again. We create an interface. We add whatever methods we need. It doesn't have to be one method, it can be like 10 methods, whatever methods you need to communicate back to the activity. And then in the on attach is where you actually grab an instance of that listener. And basically we are checking to see if it's an instance, does it implement the iListener? If it does, we just initialize the mListener, which is the local one that's stored here, with a casted version of the context. If not, we just throw an exception. The exception is mainly for you as a programmer or a tester to get to know that there is something wrong. For you to be able to use this fragment, we expect that the hosting activity needs to implement that interface. All right, so please let me know if you have any questions, and enjoy using fragments. Thank you.